Hi, this is Dr. Joby. We're going to take a look now at a media studies timeline. In addition to media psychology, there is a department called Media Studies, and we draw greatly on this organized history of media studies because it is closely related to the fields of media psychology. So much of the early research that is discussed in media studies took place by sociologists within sociology departments and also by psychologists within psychology departments. So we're going to look at this history of media studies as an interdisciplinary approach to understanding our history of media psychology and the role that psychology has played in media studies. I guess the earliest that I can identify, the earliest studies that we could consider as media studies, I think we can certainly go back to Wilhelm Wundt, who had um, an elaborate research methodology of understanding how different stimuli affected individuals through perception and emotion and cognition. And Wundt actually started his research with a metronome, one of these devices that musicians use, a mechanical device that keeps a tempo. You've seen these on the top of a piano when one rehearses a new piece of music, and it keeps a steady beat like the one I'm tapping now with my pencil. And Wundt did early research on how different tempi, different speeds of time, affected individuals emotionally, and he came up with an elaborate system of graphing these the response, the emotional response, and the cognitive and physiological response of these different tempi, different tempos, we might say speeds. So Wundt was we can consider some of this as media research. We also have the Gestalt psychologists will be a major player in studying of media, specifically perceptual studies in art. So three-dimensional representation on two-dimensional surfaces, such as a painting or a photograph, and how we experience depth. The Gestaltists in organizational, certainly Max Wertheimer was interested in apparent motion, Wolfgang Kohler and Kurt Kafka, going into Rudolf Arnheim, who became one of the foremost psychologists of art and architecture. Arnheim's Gestalt psychology books are still used today in architecture programs. I guess one of the very prominent individuals was Hugo Munsterberg, who in 1916 wrote an entire book and a collection of essays on experiencing this new thing called the photoplay. Today we call it cinema or moving pictures. And we'll discuss that book in depth in a future part of the course. But Hugo Munsterberg, 1916 was publishing on the experience of film. So these psychology and the media have a long and rich history, and we can actually look back prior to this to the ancient Greeks, which we will be doing, and understanding how media and technology, the media and technology of writing, going from an oral culture to a written culture, how this was received and discussed by philosophers such as Plato's character Socrates in the dialogues that we'll discuss shortly. For right now, let's take a look at this, the media studies. We're going to start in the 1940s. And one of the earliest figures that we find in the 1940s in this school of functionalism is an Austrian sociologist, someone who really developed quantitative research of the media. He was a sociologist, trained in mathematics, had a deep interest in research methodology, wrote books on quantitative and qualitative research in the social sciences, and his name is Paul Lazarsfeld. And Lazarsfeld has a great connection to us at Rutgers Newark because he began his American career as a sociologist and researcher into the media at Rutgers University, Newark. Well, actually, it was the University of Newark at the time. It's now Rutgers University, Newark. But Lazarsfeld came to the United States and began working as a researcher on campus at that time. And this was around 1937. Now, Lazarsfeld work gained some interest because when he was in Europe, he and a few colleagues did research on the effects of unemployment in a small town in Austria, and the research was was published worldwide, and it caught the interest of individuals here in the United States, and he was offered research positions. One of those research positions that came after his 1937 tenure at University of Newark was from Princeton University, and Princeton University was looking at doing research on the effects the effects of radio. It was called the Radio Research Project, and Lazarsfeld was operating within a school we call functionalism, and it's how the individual and groups function in the environment. So through the 1940s, mass communication, the effect of mass media, became central in academic studies in sociology and also in psychology. And the Princeton Radio Research Project lost funding, and it was moved to Columbia University, where it was renamed as the Bureau of Applied Social Research. And this is when Lazarsfeld was, he was one of the founders of the Bureau of Applied Social Research, and they came to do some major research, and we're going to look at that now. This is the 1940s functionalism. So these are here's a slide that shows us Paul Lazarsfeld and the Bureau of Applied Social Research. These are the proposals they put forth. They said that this project, this Bureau of studying the mass media, was interested in increasing it was that they found that the mass media increased the status for selected issues and organizations. In other words, they found that when things were on the radio, and we can apply this to television or any mass media, when things were in the mass media, it increased the status of the event. Today we might say something jokingly that if it's not on Facebook, it didn't happen. Well, this actually holds up in research. What we find that issues that are present in the mass media, television, radio, internet, at this time radio was what was being investigated. Things that appear in the mass media have greater salience. They have greater sense of importance. And in a way, if it's not present in this mass media, it's often not in the social conscious of individuals in a society. The second aspect is they found that mass media increases the idea of normal by spectacle of the oddity. So in other words, the spectacle of the oddity, we have this today when we have news programs or violent media, movies, video games, etc. The new normal becomes, the violent becomes the new normal because of this saturated violence in the media. So it's saying that mass media increases the idea of normal. It changes the idea of normal. What's normal is what happens in the mass media. And they referred to this as the spectacle of the oddity. Mass media also decreases public action while increasing consumption. There was a saying in a book in the 1960s that said that the revolution will not be televised. And this is exactly the idea that an individual didn't go out into the streets, was not protesting, was not doing active things to initiate social change, but was just watching programs or listening to programs. This we could humorously say this is like watching someone exercise on television, and that satisfies the need to exercise. I'm so exhausted after watching people on an exercise program. So it decreases public action and increases consumption of the media. And finally, it propagates social issues by monopolization, canalization, and supplementation. And these are three concepts that are very important to us in media psychology. Monopolization is the concept that claims that that the media doesn't give equal airspace to others. So what is controlled, who gets the stage in mass media, in a capitalist culture, it is the gatekeepers are largely the executives and advertising money. What gets this is, we'll find in media literacy chapters that we study that monopolization is a real issue in capitalism, as well as state-run media. This is always filtered through the government. You might be surprised to learn that the United States is not number one in freedom of the press, because, of course, freedom of the press is only freedom from government intervention, not corporate intervention. So any type of privatized, which largely all network news are privatized, control what makes it or does not make it onto the news. The First Amendment does not protect private industry. It just protects individuals from the government. So we'll be looking more into detail about this. So monopolization. Canalization is the idea that there's not a platform offered to certain groups. We see this in certain political campaigns. If we have two mainstream parties running, the third party often doesn't get the time and news coverage that the two major parties do. This is canalization. And also supplementation. This is mass media offers the opportunity of supplementing a media message with a face-to-face interaction. So this has influence on the message when we hear it from someone's voice or when we see an individual expressing it. This Lazarsfeld at the Bureau, at the BASR, found that this enhances the media message that is given. In 1944, there was a very famous study, very influential study called The People's Choice, and this came out of Lazarsfeld's research lab at Columbia. And it was focused on understanding how the mass media influenced the American voter. Now, what we take away from this, we take away the findings that very little effect is made when viewing political messages on an individual's voting tendency. So, in other words, to summarize this, when liberals watch conservative ads or conservative news ads, it reinforced their liberal views. When conservatives watched liberal ads or liberal news programs, it reinforced the conservatives' views. So regardless of what the media message was, it reinforced the views of the individuals. This was true for 95% of the participants. Only 5% of the participants would watch an antithetical news message or news ad or political ad and have an effect of changing their mind on a vital topic, on their voting tendency. So this is very important for us to consider today. This idea that it's really this 5%, the political ads and the news media is actually reinforcing the individual's point of view, and it's really only 5% of the voting population that will change. And this is what we refer to as the swing voters. The other thing that Lazarsfeld is very well known for is his two-step flow model of communications. And we're going to be looking at this in detail in this course. But to give a brief synopsis of it, it had been the view that media affected individuals. In the two-step flow theory, Lazarsfeld found that media didn't directly affect individuals, that individuals were affected more by community leaders who were in fact affected by media. So if an individual who was viewed as having some sort of clout or community leadership was affected by the media, those individuals then affected other individuals in the society. So instead of what was called the hypodermic needle theory or the bullet theory, in other words, that people watch something and it affects them, instead Lazarsfeld and his researchers found that what actually happens is the community leaders, the people who hold prestige in a society, are the ones who are the opinion shapers and the opinion formers. So the mass media affects them, and then those individuals influence the second stage of individuals in society. So through the 1960s, this is a very tumultuous time in the 1960s, post-World War II, 1950s was really a consumer culture, mass media culture. The 1960s civil rights movement was in full swing, as well as the Vietnam War, and this created a different approach to media. And what we find is Lazarsfeld's functionalist approach and the effects studies really becoming predominant in mass media studies. So Lazarsfeld, in the functional approach we found here, as we've discussed, Lazarsfeld's famous study, The People's Choice, was World War II, and post-World War II, does the media influence American voter? And they observed a sample for 6 months and found that the media reinforced a pre-existing political view in 95% of the subjects, and only 5% of subjects were converted by the political message. So by the 1960s, we have Lazarsfeld's two-step flow model that we just discussed, replacing the bullet theory and the hypodermic needle theory. And this really led to the media effects approach. And I think this is what many people think of when they consider media psychology, this kind of cause and effect, the mass media, or the media, the news, or the commercial, or the film, or the video game has a direct effect on the individual. And this was the approach really popular through the 1960s, this media effects approach. And as we had mentioned before, Lazarsfeld's two-step flow model was really the predominant model at this time. Audience is affected by the leaders. So there are followers and leaders, and the media affects the leaders. The leaders' opinion then affects the audience members, the following audience members. They also began to view audience members as having free will in effect. Audience was capable of accepting or rejecting media messages. So this idea that the media just turned individuals into robots was really being scrutinized. And mass media reinforced existing public opinion through leaders and opinion formers. So mass media, certainly the media can reinforce, it was found, can reinforce previous held beliefs and stereotypes. They were looking at things in the 1960s such as the effects of violent media, mass media as a lowering of cultural standards. So in other words, there was a real distinction between high culture and low culture, or pop culture and high culture. Some folks still talk about this today, but mostly in media studies we consider culture as culture, and we are aware of not to make this kind of power structure statement about high and low culture, not privileging the culture of the traditionally educated. So we have mass media as seen as lowering the cultural standards. And one of the first television studies in the UK was looked at over almost 2,000 UK viewers and non-viewers in the television, and they found that TV influenced only in areas where no previous position was formed and was most effective when dramatic. So television was very effective if there was no previous introduction to the topic. And narrative, drama, what we call the mythos, the myth, the story, was the most effective aspect. We even know this in teaching today. Students respond well and retain well to information that's in the context of a story or a narrative, and this is why oftentimes professors will put information illustrate it within some sort of story, and often a personal story. And this has been found to aid in memory. By the 1960s, George Gerbner, this is a big name that we study in media psychology, he began what's called cultural indicators research within media effects. And basically, cultivation theory was looking at the long-term effects of media. So whereas media effects was looking at this classic kind of control and experimental group, and what is the immediate effect of say, violent media or pornography, etc., Gerbner was interested in cultivation theory. What are the long-term effects? Almost like the many hours of television viewing over a long period of time. How does this affect an individual? And he found that TV has long-term effects, which are small and gradually accumulated in significance. And Gerbner analyzed 450 New Jersey school children and heavy TV viewers versus non-TV viewers, and he found that heavy TV viewers saw the world as a more dangerous place. And this is an aspect of cultivation, of the cultivation theory. It's also known today as the mean world syndrome. And it has been found repeatedly that individuals who watch the news, and especially now in 20th century and 21st century 24/7 news cycle, as CNN began this 24-hour news stream, we find that individuals who do watch these news programs excessively tend to have a positive correlation with how with viewing the world as a dangerous place. So as the amount of hours that goes up, the worldview of being a dangerous place goes up as well. So we can trace this back to 1960s cultivation theory with Gerbner. By the 1970s, we saw a trend to what is known as uses and gratification theory. And with uses and gratification theory, and this is specifically by a researcher named Elihu Katz, and Elihu Katz was interested in how individuals chose and used the media to fulfill certain needs that were in the individual. And Katz advocated a more active role by the audience. This was, not just a passive audience receiving information. This was a person that had certain needs that were fulfilled by the media, and the media that individual sought out. We can imagine individuals who are seeking out violent action films or romance films, or intellectual sort of documentaries. What are the needs of that individual that the media are fulfilling? And in this way, this is not just the media affecting the individual. This is the individual having an active role in media consumption. The viewer uses the media in a self-confirmatory way. So in other words, the individual uses the media to look for role models, to confirm things about themselves and their own worldview. They look to the media to understand personal relationships and identity, and also to acquire new information about the world. So this is the uses and gratification theory. Katz's uses and gratification theory. And it still remains a very interesting area of media studies today. Now, simultaneously with the media effects study and uses and gratification theory, there was a school of thought that continues to this day called critical theory. It's called the Frankfurt School. Now, this is very, very prominent in my media studies training. My media studies training in media psychology was heavily influenced by Frankfurt School critical theory. And this began in the 1920s in Frankfurt, Germany, at the Frankfurt School, the University of Frankfurt Institute for Social Research, and was a combination of psychoanalytic psychology and Marxist political theory. Now, there's an interesting thing. We will be studying Marx in depth, Marxist analysis of the media, and this continues to be one of the most prominent areas of media study research. And the early writings of Marx, as Erich Fromm has taught us and wrote extensively in his in one of his major books, Marx, in his earliest writings, was truly a psychologist in nature. So psychoanalysis and Marxism is combined into this thing called critical theory. One might ask, what is the connection between Marx and Freud? Well, Freud talked about a conscious and an unconscious layers in the individual, and Marx talked about similar levels of cultural superstructure and a substructure, and he felt that ideology is what we needed to identify in the media machine, in the cultural machine. And the Frankfurt School folks, Theodor Adorno, once they came to the United States, we're talking individuals, their names, just to get them in your ear, are people like Theodor Adorno, Horkheimer, Max Horkheimer, Herbert Marcuse, Eric Fromm, Walter Benjamin, and today still living is Jürgen Habermas. These were the individuals who were really identified with the Frankfurt School. So we have a focus on ideology. And this moved to New York eventually. This moved to New York from Frankfurt to escape Nazi persecution. And Adorno really talked about what he called the culture industry. One of my favorite quotes by Theodor Adorno is when he talked about his criticism of pop music, popular music. So this is music that you hear every time. It's always the same. And he referred to this as making the listener rhythmically obedient. What does this mean? Well, he felt that listening to, let's take an example, any type of popular pop song that's on the radio, it's not difficult to listen to it. You can hear it the first time and get it. It doesn't take any intellectual work. It doesn't take any thinking. Compare this to something like classical music or jazz. When Miles Davis recorded a jazz album, you didn't go to the concerts and listen and expect to hear that album repeated in his performance. The jazz album was an advertisement of what you can expect to hear when you go to hear him live. But in jazz, you never play the same thing twice. That's the essence of improvisation, is spontaneous composition in the moment. So going to a jazz concert would not be rhythmically obedient. Every time a jazz musician plays a tune, it's a different experience. Different musicians will play in different ways, different combos, quartets, trios, quintets. So when you go to listen to a jazz concert, you never say, oh, they don't sound like they sounded on the album. The expectation is not there. You expect them not to sound like they sound on the album. This is one of the criticisms of, say, like smooth jazz. Smooth jazz is an enjoyable genre of jazz, but the critics that do not care for it, they criticize it for being nearly identical replications of what you hear on the radio or on the recording. Classical music takes a great deal of knowledge and repeated listening and work to begin to appreciate. Now compare this with pop songs. Pop song on the radio, usually in 4/4, usually a very square beat. And Adorno criticized this and said that people become addicted to easy listening, easy to digest, non-thoughtful culture and music. So Adorno said that this type of media dumbed down individuals, and what this constant flow of easy to digest, non-thinking, passive music and art and television programming was dumbing down the masses, was dumbing down individuals. And this resulted in a majority of people who didn't think critically, didn't think actively, were lulled into a sort of a passivity, a lazy passivity. And this affected democracy because the people who still did think, the people who didn't get caught in this trap of the mass media, were now in control. This is really the point of Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. Whereas in 1984 by George Orwell, the criticism was that books were banned, Huxley said in Brave New World, this was not going to be the case. We didn't have to worry about books being banned because people would just stop reading books. And this is really an expression of Adorno's idea of the culture industry affecting democracy. So that went from the 1920s through the 1960s. It continues today as a force in media philosophy, media studies, and media psychology. Also in the 1960s is a figure that we really need to be aware of. This is Marshall McLuhan, and we will watch some videos of McLuhan. McLuhan was an absolutely amazing thinker, a Canadian who really affected media studies and how we think about the media. His famous idea, the medium is the message. For example, the medium of the message means we're here looking at a PowerPoint presentation. You get the bullet points. Instead of reading through an index text and having to pick out the important parts for yourself, I deliver the important parts for you. What does this tell you? The medium is the message. This means that the medium is teaching you to passively skim and just get pieces of soundbite ideas, and that's real knowledge, rather than reading something in depth and knowing it. This is why I require that you also read the books, read the text, watch the videos, not just listen to my commentary, because the message of a book, reading a book takes time. Reading an essay in a journal takes less time. So you go very much into depth in a book. You go slightly into depth with a journal article. A PowerPoint presentation, you're very skimming. You're just getting the idea. And so the medium forces this upon us, according to McLuhan. It also results in some problems. When we get addicted to bullet point PowerPoints, we get lazy. We don't want to read and chew around the bone and work for the information ourselves and process it and think of it in our own way. We just trust the authority, the author's authority, the professor's authority as being quote unquote expert and delivering us the strong points that we don't have to think about. We just memorize and then we repeat these things mindlessly. So McLuhan's idea is the medium of the message. He said the medium shapes the mind. My goodness, this is what we're going to talk about in our section on how the media affects neurology and how we think when we study The Shallows by Nicholas Carr. Oral, print, sound, electronic, each of these media has us think in a different way. Original oral culture. Today we have this in audiobooks. Many of the books that we have in required reading in this course are also available on audible.com on audio. This is a oral tradition is a different, listening is much different than reading. Reading with hyperlinks is a much different approach. You could imagine reading with hyperlinks on a screen where you have the decision, should I continue reading this article or should I move on? This is much different than an analog book. It may even feel like a certain attention deficit, some sort of I don't know where to go, I don't know how far to go into things before finishing it, skipping from one essay to the next via hyperlinks. This is the electronic media. So he also proposed this idea of a global village, which we saw manifest with the internet. McLuhan didn't live to see this, but the global village is the idea that technologies will converge, bringing people closer together. That it would become a smaller world through technology, and this is clearly happening and has happened today, where we could, in the past, if you wanted to make friends with someone from another culture, you might write to an agency that would give you a pen pal and you'd exchange letters. Any of us can go online right now and talk to anyone around the world who has an internet connection. This is the idea of the global village, and we're influenced by these people. So the world becomes a much smaller place with technology. This is Marshall McLuhan, his famous statement, the medium is the message, and we'll be listening to this as well. The medium is the message was a book and a audio recording I'm going to include for your required listening. So 1960s is also marked by semiology, structuralism, and deconstruction. These are very important things. Here are some of the big names: Ferdinand de Saussure, C.S. Peirce, Roland Barthes, Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, and Jean Baudrillard. So who are these individuals and what is this about? This is really the introduction of what we might call postmodernism. So Ferdinand de Saussure started an idea called semiology. Semiology is, as we will learn, is the study of how signs take on meaning. So words and pictures, these images and sounds have arbitrarily been matched with ideas, concepts. So Saussure began exploring this. Swiss-French philosopher began discussing these ideas of how symbols, iconic symbols, so visual symbols and audio symbols, became related with words and how meaning emerges from this context. C.S. Peirce, this was a very good friend of William James, the first American psychologist, founded the psychology department at Harvard. C.S. Peirce is probably the most influential philosopher that America has produced, yet most folks have never heard of him. Peirce developed what he called semiotics. He was also the founder of the theory of pragmatism, which greatly influenced psychologists John Dewey and William James and others. Peirce expanded Saussure's semiology into a much more textured and complex system of understanding. And we have something called this Peircean triangle. The Peircean triangle is, we studied a little bit in the first lecture of having a sender and a receiver, and we have something called a referent and a code. And we'll be going into this in depth, but Peirce's system of semiotics shows how symbols take on meaning, how information becomes knowledge by being organized in a certain way. It's very similar to Gestalt theory. So we're going to leave Peirce and semiotics at that. Roland Barthes is very famous for his work on what we call the death of the author. And Barthes was interested in understanding through German idealism this the idea that culture could be decoded by means of reading the signs within the text. So this was almost, in a way, kind of like a psychoanalytic reading of the text, but focused on ideology and entering in Marxist theory with this. Roland Barthes was one of the most famous concepts that we want to take as this brief historic introduction. Barthes was interested in how we never step into the same book twice. Barthes said every time we return to the book, every time we return to the movie, we're experiencing a different book and a different movie because we are participating in that book. We're participating in that film, in that video game. And this is also why individuals can each have an extremely different experience with any medium. So two of us can go to the film together, and we experience two different films. Now, this is really not in the objective empirical tradition that has become so dominating in psychology. This comes from what is known as German idealism. And in German idealism, we study not the objectivity of something, not even the subjectivity of an object, but the elimination of subjectivity and objectivity and the interplay of what we call reality. So this is, we're going to look into Barthes in depth, but for right now, just to give you an idea, this is a French philosophy based on idealism, German idealism. Michel Foucault was very interested in power structures. What are the power structures that exist, that privilege power structures? So in other words, years ago, if you read a book in academics, that was the privileged medium. If you watched a movie, that was kind of scoffed at. We might even look at the privileging of reading over listening to a text. So Michel Foucault was interested in the cultural power structures, centralized and marginalized communities, and how media messages and the media formats, the media, were developed and maintained by those in power to keep and maintain power. So Foucault was interested in the structure of power. One of his famous books is called The Archaeology of Knowledge, and also Power Knowledge. Jacques Derrida, French deconstructionist, was a post-structural thinker who was very influenced by Freud, influenced by Marx, and did critiques of semiology and showed us how we can deconstruct binary opposites. So Jacques Derrida was interested in breaking things apart and putting them back together in new ways. If we think of taking a watch, and instead of just merely saying this is how the watch functions, you break the watch apart and combine it in new ways to understand it in different ways. So this is Jacques Derrida. And finally, Jean Baudrillard was an essayist, recently passed away in the past decade, past 5 years. Jean Baudrillard is a French essayist. He wrote on culture. He wrote on ideology and the cultural phenomenology in which we live. And his format was mostly in text, and he was actually individuals are often turned onto the ideas of hyperreality, and in his book Simulacra and Simulation, we find this idea of how consciousness and reality is a networked system, and that we now have hyperreality. Things that we take as real are fetishized simulations for which nothing like it actually exists. Think of the film The Matrix is popularly based on Baudrillard's theories, and also thinking about something like Velveeta cheese. Velveeta cheese is more cheese than any cheese is cheese, but it's artificial. It's not really cheese. It's a processed thing, and it's a hyper-real cheese. Or think of artificial grape flavoring and bubble gum. And we taste the grape, the artificial. There's nothing real about it. There is no original. But when we go back to eating grapes, we then wonder what's wrong with the grape. It doesn't taste like the grapey, and it doesn't taste grapey enough. These are just an interesting kind of brief understanding of Baudrillard's idea of hyperreality and Simulacra and Simulation, his famous book. So this is where we enter through the 1960s. In media studies. So you see we have a very philosophical twist on things. In the 1970s and 80s, we have Neil Postman and media ecology. And media ecology is really like a Gestalt social theory, social psychology theory almost, and it's how the mediated environment affects us in our lives. It was a very, very influential theory of media. Neil Postman, one of his best books is called Amusing Ourselves to Death, and he analyzes how capitalism and democracy, the negative sides of capitalism and democracy, and their effects on the media, and how that then trickles down to a dumbing down of culture. Postman was at NYU, where media ecology was the center. There's still media ecologists at NYU, and NYU has one of the most prominent media studies graduate schools in the country. So this is a broad overview of where we're at with the history, a timeline of media studies, and how that influences and informs media psychology. If you're going to become a media psychologist and study media psychology, you definitely have to spend time reading media studies.